Get ready to explore a world where horror manifests itself in cruel and relentless ways. Today, we'll delve into one of the darkest chapters in history, the use of mustard gas during World War I. Those who were struck by this dreadful chemical agent knew the true meaning of suffering. Their deaths were painful, slow, and agonizing, while those who survived were haunted by the terrible fate of their comrades. If you have a weak heart, brace yourself for intense moments, or perhaps it's best to seek another video. But for the brave souls willing to confront the horrors of the past, I invite you to leave your like and subscribe to General Jack's channel, where we'll explore the darkest corners of history together. In the dark labyrinth of war, an indescribable horror lurked in the trenches. Mustard gas, cruel and merciless, claimed lives in agonizing ways. Those who succumbed faced a slow death, permeated with pain and agony. Among the survivors, fear spread like an insidious plague. Edgar Jones, a renowned researcher at the Military Health Research Center in London, described how terror infiltrated the minds of soldiers, contaminating them like an uncontrolled virus. It was a terror that transcended the physical, penetrating deeply into the psyche of those brave men. Even without visible signs of contamination, panic seized their minds, tormenting them with a shadow of imminent death. For some, the illusion of being poisoned was more terrifying than reality. Facing the specter of death was a trial for which few were truly prepared. But what awaited those who had been touched by mustard gas was even darker, more sinister. The solution for the afflicted was not as simple as for those who remained unscathed. And so, in the bowels of war, horror persisted, lurking relentlessly, awaiting its next victim. Amidst the suffocating darkness of the trenches, Soldier Robert struggled to maintain his sanity. The unsettling whispers of mustard gas seemed to reverberate in his mind, filling it with terror and despair. His eyes, now accustomed to the gloom, scanned the shadowy corners for any sign of imminent danger. Every sound, every shadow, felt like a looming threat, ready to engulf him in its deadly embrace. Robert's heart raced erratically in his chest, a growing sense of anguish filling his being. Suddenly, a burning sensation seared his chest, followed by a piercing pain that made him double over in agony. His hands trembled as he attempted to breathe, the air turning to embers inside his lungs. With a muffled cry, Robert fell to his knees, his vision blurred by the excruciating pain. The voices of his comrades around him became distant, muffled by the incessant buzzing in his ears. He knew he was losing the battle, that the gas had found a way to infiltrate his body, corroding him from within. And as the darkness engulfed him, a single certainty persisted in his tormented mind. War had found a new way to claim lives, a more cruel and insidious form than any other. Robert's comrades, James and Emily, watched helplessly as he writhed in agony. James, with his desperate expression, tried to calm Robert, while Emily, tears streaming down her eyes, desperately searched for some solution. But they were not immune to the devastating consequences of mustard gas either. James, his breathing increasingly labored, felt an unbearable burning sensation on his skin, while Emily struggled against a dizzying lightheadedness that threatened to make her faint at any moment. As the horror unfolded before their eyes, a sense of helplessness enveloped them, as if they were trapped in a nightmare from which they could not escape. War, with its relentless cruelty, turned them into mere victims of a senseless tragedy. And as the mustard gas continued to corrode their bodies and minds, Soldier Robert, James, and Emily faced the darkest challenge of their lives, unsure if any of them would emerge unscathed from the depths of the horror that surrounded them. Robert's comrades, James and Emily, watched helplessly as he writhed in agony. James, with his desperate expression, tried to calm Robert, while Emily, tears streaming down her eyes, desperately searched for some solution. But they were not immune to the devastating consequences of mustard gas either. James, his breathing increasingly labored, felt an unbearable burning sensation on his skin, while Emily struggled against a dizzying lightheadedness that threatened to make her faint at any moment. As the horror unfolded before their eyes, a sense of helplessness enveloped them, as if they were trapped in a nightmare from which they could not escape. War, with its relentless cruelty, turned them into mere victims of a senseless tragedy. And as the mustard gas continued to corrode their bodies and minds, Soldier Robert, James, and Emily faced the darkest challenge of their lives, unsure if any of them would emerge unscathed from the depths of the horror that surrounded them. As mustard gas spread through the trenches, soldiers who were exposed experienced excruciating pain and indescribable agony. Exposure to the gas caused severe burns on the skin, resulting in painful blisters and tissue necrosis. Their eyes burned intensely, becoming inflamed and often resulting in temporary or permanent blindness. Moreover, the mustard gas was inhaled by the soldiers, causing serious damage to the lungs and respiratory tract. They coughed violently, struggling to breathe, and many developed chemical pneumonia, a severe complication that could lead to death. Those who survived the initial exposure faced a long and painful recovery process. Skin wounds healed slowly, leaving deep scars and permanent deformities. Many suffered from chronic respiratory problems, such as asthma and bronchitis, for the rest of their lives. In addition to physical damage, mustard gas left lasting emotional scars on the survivors. The trauma of facing a slow and agonizing death, and seeing comrades suffer in the same way, haunted them for the rest of their lives. As the mustard gas cloud slowly dissipated, the extent of horror was revealed. Soldiers were sprawled everywhere, some screaming in pain, others struggling to breathe. Among them, Robert, James, Emily, and a dozen other soldiers agonized, their bodies covered in blisters and wounds, their faces contorted in agony. The acrid, lingering smell of gas hung in the air, a constant reminder of the danger still surrounding them. As the wounded were tended to by their comrades, the tension in the trenches was palpable, fear looming over them like a sinister shadow. Thomas quickly tallied the number of soldiers affected by the gas, while Sarah, with teary eyes, tried to comfort the wounded as best as she could. But even they knew that the hours ahead would be crucial, and that the fate of these soldiers was far from guaranteed. As toxic fog dissipated in the trenches, the devastating effects of mustard gas became increasingly evident. Soldiers fell to their knees, clutching the ground as they screamed in pain. Robert, Emily, and other soldiers were among the afflicted, their skins marked by blisters, their eyes watering, and their throats gasping for air. Symptoms ranged from tearing and coughing to nausea and difficulty breathing. While some struggled to see through blurred visions, others felt the sharp pain of blisters forming on their skin. Exposure to mustard gas was wreaking havoc on their bodies, from the mucous membranes of their eyes and lungs to the sensitive, moist skin of their armpits and groins. The wounded were supported by their comrades as despair grew in the trenches. Acute mortality might be low, but the long-term consequences were uncertain. The threat of blindness, infections, and pulmonary complications loomed over them like a sinister shadow. Meanwhile, echoes of the past reverberated in the soldiers' minds, reminding them of the terrible battles fought with this vesicant agent. From Flanders to more recent conflicts, mustard gas left a trail of destruction wherever it went, a grim reminder of the horrors of war. In the stifling heat of the trenches, the battle for survival was only beginning, and the future remained uncertain for Robert and his fellow soldiers. Soldiers, aware of the dangers posed by mustard gas, quickly developed protective measures to confront this threat. Equipped with enhanced gas masks designed to filter out toxic vapors, they trained tirelessly to ensure they could put them to immediate use at the first sign of a chemical attack. In addition to gas masks, soldiers also utilized special clothing, impregnated with substances that helped repel the vesicant agent. These garments, though uncomfortable, were crucial in protecting soldiers' skin from direct contact with mustard gas. In camps and military bases, emergency shelters were constructed, equipped with air filtration systems, where soldiers could quickly take refuge in the event of a chemical attack. These shelters were designed to withstand the penetration of toxic vapors and provide a safe environment until the threat passed. Furthermore, specialized teams were assigned to monitor and detect the presence of poisonous gases in combat areas, using advanced chemical detection equipment. These soldiers worked tirelessly to alert their units to the imminent threat of chemical attacks, allowing them to take appropriate defensive measures in time. Despite all these efforts, the shadow of mustard gas continued to haunt the soldiers, constantly reminding them of the dangers they faced in the trenches of war. As soldiers prepared to face the horrors of mustard gas, new threats emerged in the trenches. The presence of ticks and rats heightened discomfort and fear among the ranks, already burdened by the constant tension of combat. During brief pauses between battles, soldiers attempted to rest, but even sleep was disturbed by the distant echo of gunfire and the crawl of unwelcome creatures around their makeshift shelters. The tick of ticks in the cracks of the boards and the furtive drag of rats along the trench corners mingled with the constant buzz of insects, creating a symphony of unease that permeated the air. Even in rare moments of tranquility, tension was palpable. Soldiers remained vigilant, every shadow morphing into a potential threat. Rats, drawn by the smell of food, prowled the camps at night, challenging soldiers to maintain their composure even in the darkest moments. Meanwhile, ticks lurked in soldiers' uniforms, leaving behind painful bites and the risk of blood-borne diseases. Despite efforts to maintain hygiene and personal cleanliness, it was a constant battle against these insidious parasites. Despite all these adversities, soldiers remained determined to face each challenge with courage and resilience. Each day in the trenches was a fight for survival, a battle not only against the enemy, but also against the forces of nature and the horrors of war. Despite the challenges faced in the trenches during World War I, soldiers resorted to simple yet effective precautions to deal with the threats of ticks and rats. One of the most common measures was to keep areas as clean as possible, regularly removing debris and garbage. Additionally, they built elevated platforms for sleeping, keeping them away from the damp ground and rodents. Another precaution was to store food in airtight containers, thus reducing access for rats and preventing contamination. Soldiers were also instructed to regularly check their clothing and gear for ticks and other parasites, manually removing them whenever possible. To deal with tick infestation, soldiers often employed simple techniques, such as burning fire around resting areas to ward off the insects. Additionally, they could also resort to the use of ashes or natural repellents like garlic and sulfur to deter the parasites. During moments of rest, the greatest suffering fell upon the soldiers who remained in the trenches, unable to distance themselves from the constant threats of ticks and rats. These soldiers faced extremely challenging conditions, subject to moisture and cold, often without adequate shelter. The situation within the trenches was even more challenging during the night, when darkness provided an environment conducive to parasite activity. Soldiers could barely find respite, constantly alert to avoid tick bites and rat bites. Moreover, the ongoing presence of rodents posed not only a physical nuisance, but also a health risk to the soldiers. The proliferation of tick-borne diseases, such as typhus, and infections caused by rat bites were constant concerns. Meanwhile, soldiers who remained in the trenches for extended periods often faced a sense of isolation and despair. The monotony of trench life, combined with constant danger and discomfort, undermined the morale and mental health of these men, leaving them vulnerable to exhaustion and discouragement. As nights dragged on in the trenches, soldiers fought not only against real dangers, but also against the ghosts of their own fears. The constant dread of parasites and rodents infiltrating the trenches was so pervasive that it became difficult to distinguish between dream and reality. Soldiers reported experiences of vivid nightmares and disturbing hallucinations, even while awake. The shadow of a rat would morph into a monstrous threat, and the buzz of an insect would turn into the cry of an enemy. The minds of these men, already burdened by the stress of war, became a prison of terror where the boundaries between what was true and what was imaginary blurred. Restful moments were scarcely comforting as soldiers found themselves haunted by grotesque visions and sensations of paranoia. Sometimes, even during the day, the weight of fear became nearly unbearable, and the line between reality and illusion faded into a haze of constant terror. In these adverse conditions, the soldiers' struggle was not only against the external enemy, but also against the internal demons that haunted them day and night. And so, in the depths of the trenches, the battle for sanity and survival took on epic proportions, where the horrors of war mingled with the darkest nightmares of the human mind. As the fear of parasites and rodents haunted the soldiers in the trenches, an even more sinister threat loomed over them: mustard gas. The mere smell or mention of this blistering agent triggered deep terror among the men, for they knew the horrors it could inflict. Amidst this atmosphere of constant dread, the soldiers began to experience increasingly intense hallucinations. Robert, a young soldier who had been exposed to mustard gas, saw sinister shadows dancing around him, whispering promises of pain and despair. His comrades, John and William, were not immune to the devastating effects of the gas and reported distorted visions of grotesque creatures emerging from the depths of the trenches. The hallucinations grew more intense, making it increasingly difficult for the soldiers to distinguish fantasy from reality. The simple act of closing their eyes was enough to transport them to a world of nightmares, where horror was palpable and death lurked in every shadow. Even during the day, the hallucinations persisted, haunting the soldiers as they went about their daily tasks. Every shadow, every movement in the corner of their eye, could trigger a new wave of terror and paranoia. As they struggled to maintain their sanity amidst the chaos of war, the soldiers realized that the true enemy was not only on the other side of the trenches, but also within their own tormented minds. And so, the battle for survival took on new dimensions, where the line between the real and the imaginary dissolved in a sea of madness and despair. A new threat emerged to further worsen the situation for soldiers in the trenches: hunger. With supplies scarce and living conditions precarious, finding food became a difficult and often impossible task. Robert, John, and William, already weakened by the effects of mustard gas, struggled to obtain enough food to sustain their debilitated bodies. Constant hunger haunted them day and night, adding an additional layer of suffering to their already miserable lives. Robert, whose dreams were frequently invaded by grotesque visions, now faced reality in an even crueler way. His tormented mind could not distinguish between fantasy and truth, and hunger only served to intensify his hallucinations. John, who had already witnessed the horrors of mustard gas, now fought to keep himself sane as he faced the prospect of starvation. Every moment was a battle against despair as he desperately searched for any trace of food in the desolate trenches. William, the youngest of the three, felt powerless in the face of the adversities they faced. His mind, not yet hardened by the brutality of war, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the suffering that surrounded them. Hunger, like hallucinations, seemed an unjust punishment for a young man who had barely begun to live. As the sun set over the trenches, the soldiers faced a night of hunger, fear, and despair. With each passing moment, the line between reality and illusion became more blurred, and the hope of a better tomorrow seemed increasingly distant. The longing for their families weighed like an anchor on the soldiers' hearts. Robert, John, and William, 6 months without any contact with their loved ones, felt the loneliness and emptiness deepen with each passing day in the trenches. The memories of their wives, children, and relatives were like a distant light amidst the darkness of war. Robert, whose wife had given birth to a son a few months before he was sent to the front lines, yearned to see his son's face for the first time. Every day without news from his family felt like an eternity, and the uncertainty about their fate haunted him day and night. John, a father of 3 young children, felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders as he struggled to stay sane amidst the chaos of war. The laughter of his children echoed in his mind, reminding him of what he was missing as he found himself trapped in the trenches. William, the youngest of the 3, could barely remember the faces of his mother and siblings after so many months away from home. Nostalgia consumed him, and he wondered if he would ever have the chance to return home and embrace his loved ones again. The absence of contact with their families left an insurmountable void in the soldiers' hearts. As they faced the adversities of the trenches, homesickness was an open wound that never healed, a constant reminder of everything they had left behind. As months dragged on in the trenches, Robert, John, and William began to succumb not only to the weight of war, but also to the diseases that plagued the unhealthy environment they lived in. Constant contact with dampness and lack of proper hygiene contributed to the emergence of illnesses such as dysentery and typhoid fever. Robert, already weakened by stress and hunger, found himself afflicted with a severe respiratory infection after prolonged exposure to mustard gas. His incessant coughing and difficulty breathing made every day a battle for survival, further undermining his strength. John, struggling to stay strong amidst longing and uncertainty, found himself weakened by dysentery, a disease that ravaged the trenches like a scourge. Persistent diarrhea and constant weakness undermined his resilience, leaving him at the mercy of war and the inhumane conditions they lived in. William, the youngest and most susceptible to illnesses, contracted typhoid fever after drinking water contaminated with human feces. His high fever, intense abdominal pains, and mental confusion made his existence a true torment as he struggled to stay conscious amidst the delirium caused by the illness. As diseases spread through the trenches like a sinister shadow, Robert, John, and William faced not only the threat of external enemies, but also the internal battle against the ailments that corroded their bodies and souls. Unfortunately, for Robert, John, and William, fate had a tragic end in the depths of the trenches. Weakened by war, disease, and suffering, they were unable to return home and were overcome by the adversities they faced. Their stories, marked by courage and the struggle for survival, are a testament to the harshness of life in the trenches during World War I. I hope you have enjoyed this dark and distressing journey, and that you have felt the fear and anguish that these soldiers endured. If you liked the story and were touched by it, don't forget to leave a like on the video and subscribe to General Jack's channel, so you don't miss any of our thrilling narratives.